once. Thank you, Mickey. It's only the first opening of a womb. So, if the husband goes ahead and he has the Pidyon Ben 30 days afterwards and he makes the two brachot, Shechianu and Al Pidyon Ben, these are brachot levatala. On the other hand, if the wife has to tell her husband about her very dubious past, it's likely to result in divorce and at the very least a terrible scandal. So she wants to suppress the truth, goes to the rabbi turns to Rav Ovadia, says, what shall I do? Rav Ovadia says, sveka. There is a principle known as kavod habriot. We don't try and take away people's dignity unless we really have to. And this is a type of kavod habriot here. This woman worked hard to change her life, and it will be a terrible blow to her and to her personal dignity, perhaps ruin her chances of ever marrying again if she's divorced. And there is one view that it may be that kavod habriot only applies if it is mezid. In other words, you may not break a biblical commandment for the sake of preserving human dignity if the act is done b'shogeg. If it's done b'mezid, then human dignity goes up the spout and you will obey the prohibition. So there's one doubt as to whether kavod ha-briot will overcome a biblical prohibition if the context is one of shogeg. And the husband who's going to make the two brachot is definitely shogeg. He has no idea why he should not be making those brachot. Secondly, is a bracha levatala a breach of the commandment, the third commandment of Lo tisar Shem Hashem Elohecha lashav or not? Well, there's a machloket. So we have a double doubt. Is this a case of shogeg or bezid? If it's a case of shogeg, then there's a view, the view of the Rosh, that the kavod habriot will overcome the biblical prohibition. There's also a second doubt. Is making a bracha levatala a biblical prohibition? Is it taking God's name in vain, or is it not? So Rav Ovadia says, hey presto, sveka, double doubt, and therefore I have no problem in allowing the husband to make these brachot, which are actually levatala, because we are at two doubtful removes from the biblical prohibition. And there are scores of examples. So let's go to the share screen and have a look at the world of Responsa, Rabbi Isaac the Elder of Dompierre. So our first reader in English this evening is David Parks. Line 25, please. Rabbi Isaac the Elder of Dompierre, the Re.
Rabbi Isaac Elder of Dompierre ruled that hadash in diaspora is a biblical prohibition, but one could use grain either because it may be yashan or may have come from a rare pre-Pesach root taking, bracket first out, or may be imported from the south of France, bracket second out. A double doubt, sveka, is sufficiently strong to override even a biblical prohibition.
So we love sveka, okay? Let's have a look at the Maharam, a generation or two later. Marcel, give us the Maharam of Rotterdam.
Could I ask a question about that?
Yeah, sure.
Is that really a sveka? He's saying either it is Yoshan or it's not Yoshan. That's one safek.
Now, of course, Ranon, you've opened up a can of worms. There are two types of sveka. One is a safek in the law. One is a safek in reality. Now, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and I hope you noticed this, used legal svekot. Okay, is the prohibition of making the bracha levatala overridden by kavod habriot in theory if it's a case of shogeg, and in any case is bracha levatala midoraita or midrabanan. Now that's a strong sveka. This is a much weaker sveka because this is a sveka in reality, and we don't know what the reality is. So without going into a long exposition, absolutely true. There's a fundamental difference in halakha between a svek svek in relation to reality, mitziut, and a svek svek in relation to the law, okay? But because I don't have time to go into that, I will only say at this stage that is why you could be a little dubious about this particular svek sveka, and thank you for taking some of this wind out of my sails, because I was trying to, as it were, pull a fast one, but you were definitely quite correct in pulling me up. So it's not so strong, and that's why I've given you more views, okay? And you'll see your point is absolutely spot on. Marcel, the Maram of Rottenburg.
Not only it's weak, but when you say maybe it is Yashan, we know that it is not, because, as you said, in north of France, it was not Yashan.
Well, no, it may be that somebody brought from the Mediterranean basin some grains and produced.
This is the second dot, but the first dot is very
weak. Exactly. You're all on the ball, and I'm very glad. But when you need to, you can always create a svek sveka or a quasi svek sveka or a svek sveka that just justifies you in allowing people to do what they will and need to do because of reality. But let's have a look at the Maharam. For the third
Rabbi Rottenberg, 1220 to 1293, held that Chadash is forbidden in the diaspora under biblical law.
Again, the majority view, it is Asur Midoraita, but
specifically declined to issue any practical ruling on the matter. He himself was careful to eat only Yashan when it was available.
So Jean and Ranon, you see that the Maram doesn't go for svek sveka, doesn't like the rematch. He said, look, I'm not going to give a ruling because it is better they should be shogegin than mizidin. It's impossible. But I myself, I'm going to keep what I regard as the halakha. And he was careful only to eat
Yashan.
And why did they could have said that Rav Papa and the great Rav Huna said that it is the Rabbanan? Can we, B'shat Atrak, you can rest on such an opinion?
You need more. A svek svek is much nicer than having to say the majority view is that it is midoraita. Minority view is that it is midrabanan. So I'm going to say it is midrabanan. Authentic poskim don't like doing that. They'd much rather go on a svek. Okay? Again, we could talk about this for a couple of hours, but we're going to move on if we can. It's very exciting, clearly. And we haven't even got to the most exciting bit yet. Run on, okay. Rosh. You must be muted. Exactly.
Rosh suggests that Jews ask grain sellers when their grain took root and act in accordance with their reply.
Which is what you would expect, okay? Look, ask.
This is a chumrah.
Yeah, another chumrah, but okay. I mean, it's a question of reality, mitziut. So ask, He does,
however, add that he remembers that in his youth, his teachers would refrain from eating grain that was not yashan, but would not issue a practical ruling to forbid chadash. He himself follows their policy and applies the principle that in this type of situation, better that people sin inadvertently than advertently.
Now, why do you think the Rosh doesn't seem to feel agonized over this? And it's to do with history and geography. Why was the Rosh not overly bothered with the Isur on Hadash?
Talmud of the Maram.
He was
especially the Rosh is in Spain.
Exactly. The Rosh was the Talmud of the Maram in Germany. The Maram tried to escape and then was captured by Rudolf and was shut up in prison for 12 years in the castle. But the Rosh succeeded in getting to Spain. And when he wrote this tshuva, okay, he's in Spain. And Spain is part of the Mediterranean basin. They don't have such a problem. That's why he says, I remember in my youth when I was in Germany, in Ashkenaz, and that's what the Maram said. Everybody's eating Chadash, okay? They don't have any Yashan, but my teacher, the Maharam, and others of his ilk, they would seek out Yashan, and they would have to eat far less and drink far less beer, okay? But only them. They did not expect the flock to adhere. And that's why the Rosh is a fairly sanguine here, and he talks about his youth. But he does say that even when he's in Spain now, he's not going to ride a hobby horse on this issue and say, you people must always be careful to eat Chadash because there are difficulties. Now, we see the difference between Sfard and Ashkenaz, between Southern Europe and Northern Europe very clearly in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. So let's read the Shulchan Aruch. Robert, please. Rabbi Caro.
Rabbi Caro in the Shulchan Aruch, Yoredea 293.2, follows the classical Sephardi line and simply rules that Hadash is forbidden in the diaspora, and the fact that grains were grown by non-Jews is irrelevant.
Now, this was something we mentioned earlier. One of the possibilities that was raised when we discussed the Gemarot was that you might be able to make a distinction like we do in Orla and Kilayim between land farmed by Jews, owned and farmed by Jews, and land owned and farmed by non-Jews. If it's owned and farmed by non-Jews, then Kilayim and Orla will not apply. And then you could perhaps, Jean, go back to the point that if there is a view that Chadash is midrabanan, even though it is a minority view, and you combine the fact that in relation to Orla and Kilayim in Chutz La'aretz, it is clear that the Isur will not apply if the land is owned and farmed by non-Jews, then you could say that if the Chadash comes from fields which are owned and farmed by non-Jews, then also it should be permitted to Jews. Okay? So that would be another way of going about it, but Rabbi Caro forecloses that. Okay, and he says that the fact that grains were grown by non-Jews is irrelevant. Robert, do you want to have a crack at the Sif in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. אסור לאכול חדש מתבואת 5 המינים עד שיקרב העומר שהוא בט"ז בניסן, שנאמר לחם וקלי וכרמל לא תאכלו עד עצם היום הזה, והעידנה דלך העומר אסור כל יום ט"ז.
And that goes back to the sugya in Malachot, John, that you pointed out last time, that today, in Sfard at least, the whole of the day is forbidden in terms of Chadash. ובחוץ לארץ,
ובחוץ לארץ שעושים בית ימים, אסור כל יום י"ז עד תחילת ליל י"ח.
And we have, because of Sfei Shel Yom, we have to wait until the night of the 18th. איסור
החדש נוהג בין בארץ ובין בחוץ לארץ, בין בשל ישראל, בין בשל עובד עקום, תבואה שלא השריתה קודם לט"ז בניסן, אסורה עד שיבוא העומר הבא.
Rabbi Caro, Spain, and the Balkans and Tzfat has no problem. Omer applies midoraita in Chutz La'aretz. There are no shtikim and no trickim here, as it were, and you have to wait until the Omer, or the date that the Omer used to be offered up in the temple, and you have to add the doubt of the second day of Yom Tov, and therefore only on the 18th can you actually eat them. But there's no problem because it's there. A whole new crop has taken root just before Pesach. We harvested beginning with barley, and that harvesting permits all the grains right through the summer, and then we only have a few months to wait until we have the winter planting and we have the next crop coming up. But the Ramah, who lives where?
In Krakow.
In Krakow, Poland, that's a different story. So the Ramah incorporates the complex Ashkenazi approach in his glosses. Okay, Jean, I'll go up to you. Would you like to read from line 12? Haga, umikol makom.
C'est 9. Umikol makom konstam tvua shari la'achar ha'Pesach.
Shari means allowed, okay? Oh, any grain is permitted after Pesach. Mikoach?
Mikoach safek sveka.
So the Ramah also goes on the sveka, knowing it's not that strong, but at least it's something. Safek hu.
ספק היא משנה שעברה,
It
donc the
might be
same
very
as
old
re.
grain indeed. Who knows? Okay. Ve'im timtza
ואם
lomar.
תמצא לומר משנה זו, מכל מקום דילמה נשרשה קודם האומר, תור בשם הראש.
Now, the Tur is speaking of Shem HaRosh. The Tur, who is a Rosh's son, lived in Spain. So it's easy for the Rosh and the Tur to say, you know, the likelihood is that everything took root before the Omer. But that definitely doesn't apply in Poland. So we have a Sfek Sveka here, which, as we've said, is not particularly convincing. So the Ramah has more things to say. Jean, uvimine tvua.
ובמיני תבואה שזורים ודאי לאחר פסח.
Now the Ramah says, but look, you know, if we're talking about reality, we cannot deny it. So there are crops. The ground is frozen right through until March or April. Cannot possibly have grown anything then. So what do we do then when we know vadai, definitely, that it's all taken root after Pesach and we should wait until the next Pesach? Kagon.
במקצת מדינות שזורים שיבולת שועל ושעורים לאחר פסח,
we only plant them after Pesach. אז
יש לו להחמיר אחר הקציר, אם לא שאין דלתות המדינה נעולות. What does it mean?
That means that, but the gates of the countries are not locked. You can have commerce.
Oui, donc on peut importer. Oui. ורוב התבואה באה במקום אחר, שזורים קודם הפסח.
And it could be that the majority of the tvua actually comes from the granaries of the south of France and of the Mediterranean basin. It could be the chen bisman.
Apparently, it's very theoretical.
It is very theoretical, and Ramah is pushing the point again, because what are you going to do? וכן
בזמן שימות החורף נמשכים לאחר פסח, ובכל הגליל ההוא זורים לאחר פסח, דברים הנזכרים, יש להחמיר ולחוש מן הסתם.
So the Ramah, as you see, is very conflicted here. He says, on the one hand, I could make all sorts of suggestions as to different realities. But at the same time, we know, and we don't want to make idiots of ourselves. So what am I going to do? So I'm going to say that actually, theoretically, we should be machmir when we know that the produce is definitely chadash. Aval bat.
אבל אין להורות לאחרים במקום שרוב שתייתן ואכילתם ממינים אלו, כי מותר שיהיו שוגגים ולא יהיו מזידים.
Drink and food is from these types. כי מוטב
שיהיו שוגגים ולא יהיו מזידים.
And because we don't want people to sin deliberately, we want to keep them in the dark. We don't want to say anything from the pulpit, because that's not the way to make Jewish law apply and to keep the congregation faithful. And this is, again, the Tur in the name of the Rosh. Trumat Hadeshen is also famous, Siman Kuf Chet, but it all stems from the Rosh. The Rosh, as I said, was in Spain, remembers the Minhag Ashkenaz. You can see the conflict in the Ramah here. Now, the Ramah is 16th century, died 1572. The Bach is a little later. He studied from the Talmidim of the Ramah. Let's read the Tshuva of the Bach.
But interesting that the Ramah in Poland use a conclusion from Spain where the realities are different.
Exactly. But he wasn't into realities, perhaps. The idea that, the way we approach a Tshuva is to look at it in its historical, economic, agricultural context. The Ramah is using the Sfarim. Now, he may have understood the difference, but he doesn't think it's relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. When we read Sifrei Halakha, we read Tshuvot. But Tshuvot, actually, we do. We have a lot of reality. When we read Hagaot or the Shulchan Aruch, however, let's read this very exciting Tshuva by the Bach, okay? Halo hu arav hamuvhak marana v'rabana kabranita. This is the Ramah. The Bach is writing a tshuva to the wonderful and skilled rabbi, our teacher, the captain of the exile, Reish Metifta, head of the yeshiva, the Reish Galuta, and head of the Gola, Kevodo Moreno Harav Rabbi Liva, Av Beit Din de Kilat HaKodesh Lublin Kadisha, Yishmarei Hu El Elyon. Now, I didn't put in all of the other honorific titles. This Rabbi Lever must be something, because the Bach is writing him in a very respectful way. Who is this Rabbi Lever? It's a problem that many historians, traditional and some less, have tried to figure out. Difficult to know. There are some Reb Leibs here and there that lived at the time of the Bach, but the majority think it's the Maharal of Prague. And that's why the Bach is very respectful. And we'll see what happened as we move on. Whether the Maharal was ever in Lublin is a question. There are periods of Maharam's life where we don't know where he was. Maybe that the Zetzabocha, again, made a mistake, okay? He may have been in Krakow. That's more likely than Lublin. But whatever it is, Shim'a oznai u'v'ra'u einai michtav malatcha. Bach received a letter from the Maharal, al dvar hechazan HaKohen, hanichnas rishon p'nei kes horotecha. Regarding a chazan, a kohen, chazan was a kohen. He was in the Bach's town, and it's likely to have been early in his rabbinate, either perhaps in Lubomil, probably. Bach was a young man, and this chazan has gone in first and has sent a letter to the Maharal. And now the Bach has to set the record straight. So that I not be considered to be some kind of lightweight person who doesn't undertake things seriously. Where does that phrase come from? Vayiti ve'einav kimatatea. Who?
Yaakov says to
Yaakov says to
his mother.
His mother, Olayu Musheni Avi. My father will feel my arms and I'll be a mocking joker, jester, and a fool in his eyes. Okay, that's just testing your Tanakh. Patach Dvarav, line 24. Rosh Amara B'vo Lifnei Al Dat Hanhagat Halimud Shelomdim Rabbanim Shebador B'Yeshiva. Now the Chazan, apparently, according to the Bach, when the Bach came to town, the Chazan criticizes the Bach about the way he runs the yeshiva. He said, what just teaching the boys in the yeshiva is a waste of time. It's vanity. So I said, to the Chazan, what do you mean? Main thing that to teach the young men is that they understand how to read Torah. So that they can learn and know Hebrew grammar. You don't need to learn Gemara. It's all in the Shulchan Aruch. Why do you need to learn Gemara at all? And I answered him in a respectful way. An argument we talked about often. You cannot give a practical decision on the basis of the Shulchan Aruch, which is, after all, only a book of halachic recipes. Ki al kol dvarav kimat hem stumim. Nothing the Shulchan Aruch gives you the principles or the underlying ideas. Kelashon Rambam, biprat b'dinei mamonot. Like the Rambam, and especially so in monetary matters, you need to understand principles. And anyhow, you cannot write in any law book all the situations that might arise in real life. So you've got to be able to go behind the general statements of the law and understand the finer points. וגם ברוב הדברים נחלקו גאוני עולם. And we have disputes. Rashi and Tosafot argue over the Gemara all the time. וצריך חוכמה יתרה ובקיאות הרבה, wisdom and expertise להכריע בטעם מספיק to reach a valid decision, ומי שלא רגיל בלימוד הגמרא, אי אפשר לו להורות הוראה נכונה. Whoever is not an expert in Gemara cannot possibly make a valid halakhic decision. ולא קיבל דבריי, but the Chazan refused to accept my argument. אחר כך התחיל לעורר אותי על דעת איסורי חדש. Then he started with me on the Isur of Chadash, she'eineni noheg, I do not keep the prohibition on Chadash, says the Bach. When is harbo, and he does. V'ani yishavti lo, so I answered him, she'bimei chorpi, when I was young, belomdim masechet kiddushin, natati libi lachor pashpesh b'din zeh. I researched the law of Chadash, v'matzati heter b'shel goyim, and I found the heter in terms of the grain grown and farmed by non-Jews on non-Jewish land. I have a lot of very good proofs, and whilst there is a Tosafot that disagrees with me, I am convinced that I am correct in my analysis. And another Tosafist, the Riva, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher, who is fairly unknown, but is actually quite an important Baal Tosafot. And there are some manuscripts of Tosafot that we only know because of the Riva. V'skinimo Marenu Harav Avigdor Katz. Now, Rav Avigdor Katz was a famous rabbi in Vienna. He lived in the 13th century, the early part, and many disciples, including Reb Chaim or Sarua and others. So he's a heavyweight in the Ashkenazi tradition. And the Mordechai, 14th century, Rabbi Mordechai HaKohen, who wrote the Sefer Mordechai, which is printed at the end of the Babylonian Shas, and was murdered actually with his family, the Rindfleisch massacre, but it's a very important source of Ashkenazi halakha. So I have both theoretical argument in my favor and also enough Ashkenazi authorities. I'm confident that it works, and because our grain is only grown on non-Jewish land, because nobody in the feudal system or even in the early modern period, Jews never owned land. The farming was done by non-Jews, so therefore we do not need to pay attention to the prohibition on Chadash.
Is there any difference between that and Shemitah then?
There is a lot of similarity between the Isur Chadash and the Isur of Shemitah, except that, again, without going into Shemitah, which would take us a long time, okay? Shemitah does not apply in Chutz La'aretz, of course, but in Eretz Israel, the idea is that, indeed, we sell the land, Jewish-owned land, to a non-Jew, and that takes away much of the problem of Shemitah. The issue there, of course, is that selling land of Israel to a non-Jew may infringe another biblical norm, which is lo techonem. You may not, in fact, give non-Jews, if you can help it, some ownership of land in the land of Israel. So the Chazon Ish, for example, would prefer that Jewish farmers would, in Israel, carry out labors in their fields which were only forbidden rabbinically, and keep the prohibition at the level of Midoraita, which actually gives you quite a bit of scope, okay? Rather than saying, let's sell, even if it's a nominal sale, let's sell the land of Israel to a non-Jew. But as you know, the rabbinate and the state of Israel in general has gone for the solution of nominal sale of the land of Israel, and therefore any type of work can be done by Jews on the land because it doesn't belong to them. But yes, that is a nice analogy between our problem and the laws of Shemitah, another agricultural law, and another law which is very difficult to keep in practice. Thank you, Harvey. Ve'ishiv Elai Bakas. Now, after I explained this to this Chazan, he turned on me angrily, Derech Bizayon, and he insulted me before the elders of the congregation. Who are you that you've decided to be lenient? Not your place, you young whippersnapper, as it were. How can you decide that you're going to ignore Chadash and tell people that that's what you can do? And I was quiet because I knew this man and his temperament. What does that phrase mean, and where does it come from? Hello? Anybody?
Shigayon, I think.
Who drove like a madman in the Tanakh?
Yehu.
Yehu. Thank you. I heard on
Who
my
said
left
that?
from the kitchen, Jehu. I heard also the voice on my left, Yehu. Jehu. Jehu in Melachim Bet, Perek Tet, was driving his chariot to the city of Shomron and was about to engineer a palace coup. And the watchman says to the king, look, somebody's coming and he's driving, okay, b'shigaon, like a crazy man. And then they say, that's Yehu ben Nimshi. By the way, it also entered the English language. Drive like Jehu in English means, if anybody knows, to drive like a maniac. Was used in the Victorian era of very reckless cab drivers. And for those who are into rock, there was a post-hardcore band from San Diego, the late 90s, called Drive Like Jehu. That is, of course, totally irrelevant, but there we are. So this Chazan is impossible. And the Bach says, I know him. If I started to argue with him, he would let loose of a volley, and I would be overcome by this very gross and apparently terrible, but very effective stir. So the Bach has a problem with his chazan. Okay, now, let's see what happened next. The Shabbat hotziu Sefer Torah likrot bo. Now, on the next Shabbat, okay, the young rabbi has come to his town. He already finds that the cousin is giving him grief. But then Shabbat comes, and he takes out the Sefer Torah. The cousin is the one who lames, okay? Bepitcho amad upasalota. And then he opens the Sefer Torah, takes a look and says, Posel. Mitam de'en ba revach ben teva leteva kimlo ot ktana. Because there's not a minimal space between the letters. V'sha'alet pi ma'adun badavar. Then he turns to me and says, okay, Rabbi, what do you have to say? I've told you what I think. V'ani horeti ki lo ne'emar shiur hazeh lipsol. I told him, look, that concept of having a space of a small letter between the letters is not a matter of making the Torah unfit for use. And all those principles which we learn in Masechet Menachot, the poskim and the poskim cite them, eino ela lemitzvah. It's only for the mitzvah of ze eli va'anvehu, to be more particular, to magnify and to glorify, if you like, the mitzvot. But it's not actually essential halacha. Hatna'a hitna'e lefanav b'mitzvot. Be na'eh, be as fine as you possibly can in relation to the mitzvot. Aval lo likuv klal, v'davke kishenirin be'tevot k'teva achat, litinok de'lo chakim, v'lo tipesh. And if you can bring a young boy, okay, who is not a fool and is not too clever, and he can see that these are two letters and not one, then you're fine. That's the test, not the lack of space between the letters. It's as long as you can tell that the letters are separate by a tinok, that's a young boy, who's not a fool, can read well, but he's not too clever that he can actually tell the difference between the letters. The Hu Eshiva Dvarai Pasulhu. The Chazan says, no, it's possible. The Galala Sefer Torah V'otzi Acheret. And he said, bring me another Sefer Torah. So the Bach is left there. This is the Bach, okay? Probably one of the most prominent European halachic authorities. But when you start in your rabbinical career, you never know what opposition you're going to encounter. אחר כך נתגלה לעניין ביתומה אחת ענייה, שגבו לה לצורך נישואין, והיה פת אפוי, וכל הסעודה מוכנת, ולא היה יכול להתפשר עם החתן בנדוניה. Now we have the same case that we learned in the Ramah. They married on a Friday, okay? You all remember that, right?
Yeah.
And the Nadan wasn't sufficient. And then the Khatan's family said, no, we're not going to go through with it. And then they argued and they fought and they eventually reached the compromise. It was already Shabbat. Can you do the wedding? And I did the chuppah on Friday night. The Chazan then starts a campaign against me that I broke a clear prohibition, because you don't marry on a Shabbat. And this we've learned and we know well. So again, the Chazan doesn't know much, but he makes a lot of noise. תומניה הייתה ולא היה לה אלא מה שגבו, והיא כפסיידה ואפשר נמי, אם היה נדחה נישואין, אזי היה חוזרין בהם, ותשב עד שתלבין ראשה. And it could be that if I wouldn't have done the wedding, the whole thing would have become unraveled, and she would remain unmarried until the hair of her head turns white. Pshita de mekilin ba tfei. This is definitely a case for being very lenient. In kol ze, lo itaoze nishmoa lekol morav, v'asaf elav siya mereyehu. Now, not only did he not listen to me, but he starts to organize a whole faction, v'hiliga lai kol hayom v'chol halayla, and starts to insult me day and night, b'divrei b'tzanut, and make fun of me, and make me into a mocking post. Kayadua l'kol kahal. Lomar, Horeti Bazeh Shelo Kedin Haya. All of my lucky decisions are wrong. But what did I do? I simply ignored him. Because they called him Chag Pesach She'avar. All this until last Pesach. אחר המועד, כשהותר החדש, התחיל בתקלתו וכלכלתו. Of course, we come to the issue of Chadash, and he starts with me again. I then spoke to my committee. I mean, situation cannot continue. לתקן שלא יתפשטו דבריו יותר בפרסום לפני ההמון, עם וכדאי ביזיון וקצף, from the Megillah. וגם הם היו מצטערים מאוד על אודותיו ודבריו. Now, the committee too, the heads of the community were very upset by what the Chazan was doing. So we sent one of the chief Par Nasim of the Kila, certain Reb Koppel, and we wanted Koppel to convince the Chazan to stop. And then, of course, when Koppel comes, the Chazan says, you have no right to say anything to me. You should be improving yourselves before you come and tell me what to do. Stop drinking your beer. It's all chadash. Koshu oti. Hitkoshishu v'koshu. First of all, you fix yourself up, then you criticize others. Now we get from Pesach until Parshat Dvarim in the summer, the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, now we get to another issue with the Sefer Torah. In Dvarim, Moshe says that Yoshua Tziveti Ba'et Hahi. Now, in the Sefer Torah, that Hahi is spelt with a Vav. Not unusual to have masculine and feminine mixed up, okay? So it was a vav and not a yud. Hifsik bishtika, v'lo yadarti al ma. The chazan stops laning, doesn't say anything. Don't know why. Ad shesha'alti al zeh. So I said, chazan, what's going on? Why aren't you laning? V'yigid ki nimtza ta'ut hahu shekatuv yud bimkom vav. So there's a yud instead of a vav in that word, si bait hahi. Amarti emeka klum. Now I said, no problem. Continue reading. The Chazan says, no, it's possible. Sarich lotzi acheret, bishvil ta'ut zeh. We got to take another one out. V'chazarti v'amarti ki en lotzi acheret. And I said, no, you're not taking out another Sefer Torah. You can see Shiur was becoming really interesting. He says, no, take another one out. As amarti elav amaretz. Then I really lost my temper. I said, you're an amaretz. Shote, you're a fool. Rotzata liot bal hora'ah. If you want to be a rabbi, you're not. Tigmor aseder v'lo tafsik. Finish laning. Eshivli ata amaretz. He said, no, you're the amaretz. And then he starts to throw insults at me like a Polish fisherwife, who can use that expression. Az amarti ata benidui. And then I said, okay, I'm putting you in cherem. Shata maligal divrei chazal u'mesarev neged divreihem. You are basically rebelling against Chazal and the halakhic system as a whole. Apikoros teilech ledarkecha. You're an apikoros. Get out. Or tigmor haseder. Or finish laning. V'lo tafsik, and do not stop. Echazan heshiv, ata ben nidui. I'm putting you in chera. Lama ata shoteh chadash. Why are you drinking chadash beer? Ata cholek al kol hagonim haosfim chadash. V'haemet. But the truth is, says the Bach in this long letter to the Maharal, shelo nideti oto. I actually didn't put him formally into chera. Ela kivanti. Ever kavaneti aita shehu ra'ui api masav liot benidui. He ought to be put in cheren. Ve'ino maniach tefillin b'chol hamoed v'over al lo titgodedu. He also doesn't put tefillin on a chol hamoed, which is also talked about. Against minhag Ashkenaz at the time, he's splitting the congregation. He's sur midoraita. ואינו חושש לכבוד הרבנים, הלוואי שלא היה מבזה אותם בביזיונות אשר אינם ראויים להיכתב. And I cannot even write down the insults he hurled at me and at the rabbis I have quoted. והס, כי לא להזכיר, I cannot put them down. כמו שביזה אותי כמה פעמים ברבים שלא בפניי, ובפרט מפני הנבון, כבוד מרנו הרב אבריל נרו לומר שאני מגלה פנים בתורה שלו כהלכה להתיר החדש. He harps on the fact that I am twisting halakha and not applying it truthfully in order to permit chadash. Chalila shelo katavti rak latet tam leminhag. Now the Bach makes an interesting point. He says, look, why did I write the heter in the Bach for chadash? Because of minhag. Minhag Ashkenaz, amongst the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews in Northern Europe, was not to pay attention to the Yisur of Chadash. And that is why all the Gaonim and Rishonim who saw what was happening and saw that people were not paying attention to Chadash, Shu Soter La Talmud, and there is, of course, a problem with the Talmudic position. They did their utmost to make sure that the minhag that the people had of not applying Chadash would not be interfered with. Al pi gedolim, v'kol shkein b'minhag hazeh sh'gedolim atzmam lo hayu nisharim b'isur shtiyat hechadash. Especially according to my approach, which involved many Gaonim, okay, who agree that if the land is owned and farmed by non-Jews, then we can put in the Yisur Midrabanan, Jean, as you said earlier, and we can say there's no problem with Chadash. And we have the Riva, and we have Rabbi Avigdor Katz, and we have the Mordechai and the Trumat Hadeshen, Rabbi Yisrael Islam. Although the classical codifiers, all of whom lived, Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, in Mediterranean lands, they say it's an absolute biblical prohibition. B'chol makom, Rabbi Eliezer de Perikama de Kiddushin, like Rabbi Eliezer, as we read in the first parak of Kiddushin, Udelo kavod kamo harav Rabbi Baruch shemekir b'mekomot harechokim Eretz Yisrael, kamo shekatav harosh b'tshuva. Rosh in the Tshuva mentions a Rabbeinu Baruch, who says that in lands far away from Israel, and that's where, in fact, we get into the fact that in Tshuvot, the context is a significant issue. Rabbeinu Baruch says we cannot possibly keep Chadash in the northern lands, okay? Far away from Eretz Israel.
Isn't that Maram Mirotendorf?
No, the Maram says it's Asur Midoraita.
I say Meir ben Baruch, excuse me.
No, this is a different Rabbeinu Baruch.
Yes.
Rabbi Meir, all right?
Meir ben Baruch.
Yeah, and there's more than one Baruch. בתשובה כלל ב' אומנם נאסור חדש, אף של גויים דבר זה אינו מפורש לאיסור לא בתלמוד ולא בפסקי הגאונים, זולת התוספות כתבו ושם אינם משמע לחדש נוהג אף של goyim. Now, I know that there's a Tosafot and Yerushalmi that are stacked against me. Uvemet tema gdola nireh beinai al rayot ha-Tosafot me-Yerushalmi. Now, I'm in line 30 at the 3 dots. The Bach then goes into a long discussion of why this opinion of the Tosafot, one Tosafot only, and the Yerushalmi, that even if the land is owned and farmed by non-Jews, the Chadash is still Asur Midoraita, is not a convincing one. I chose not to go into that because I want to finish the topic. If you want, in your spare time, you're welcome to open up the Bach and to read the full Tshuva and its many pages of dense halachic reasoning. Also have a proof from Masechet Rosh Hashanah that if it's owned by non-Jews and farmed by them, then the Chadash will be permitted. So it is very clear. My case is very strong, and the Chadash in Chutz La'aretz only applies to a land owned and farmed by Jews. Maharil, okay, the founder of Nusach Ashkenaz, okay, also adopts the same view. We know that people who are really frum will be machmir. ומה שמחזק כל זה הוא התשובה שבידי למהר"ם, שכתב שרבנו אביגדור כץ כתב בספרו דחדש בחוץ לארץ אינו נוהג בשל גויים, וזה לשונו שהשיב ריבה, הדחדש נוהג בחוץ לארץ, הנימיני בשל ישראל, אבל בשל גויים אינו נוהג בחוץ לארץ, ויכול לשתות שיכר אפילו בחורף. So you can go into the winter still drinking your beer and you'll live. What will we do without the beer? גם בהג משמע דחדש שנוהג בחוץ לארץ בשל גויים. ועל זה סמכו העולם הגאונים שהיו קרוב לזמננו. This is recent. It's not the classical. It's not the Rambam, not the Gemara. It's certainly not Babel. It's not the Gemara. It's not the Rambam, not the Shulchan Aruch. But it is what Ashkenazi Jews were doing when they encountered a agricultural reality that basically made keeping the prohibition on Chadash impossible. And what the Bach is saying is that our Ashkenazi tradition, this we're going to talk about because it's very important. Our Ashkenazi tradition is always to try and accommodate what people do with halakha. And the Tosafot, the first Tosafot in Shas, Me'emar Taikorin Kriyat Shema Ba'aravim. First Tosafot who lived in Northern Europe, Dampierre, Rameru, okay, Troyes. They're all asking, but if you can only say Shema at nightfall, how come we in the lands north of Europe where it gets dark very late, how come we daven Maariv early and say Shema? And so you get Rabbeinu Tam who gives us 2 shkias and we get a whole thing and we end up with the Shkiat HaChama, not nightfall. That's all because we're a long way from Eretz Yisrael where all of this was meant to be. The Mishnah doesn't know about northern France. Doesn't know about Germany. The Mishnah knows about the Middle East. And then nightfall is nightfall. In summer and winter, not such a huge difference. It also doesn't take into account that it was dangerous to be out after dark and all that. But right through Shas, if you look at the Tosafot, they're always, especially Masechet Avodah Zarah, they're accommodating what people needed to do in order to live. And if you have no Jews, then you have no mitzvot. So you have to have people who are able to live in the context in which they find themselves geographically, agriculturally, and economically. So, line 35, and this is particularly, remember, Jews from Germany moved east to Poland, and we'll talk about this next week, what attracted them to Poland and what made Jewish life successful when it was, and also what carried in the ingredients of failure and rife anti-Semitism, okay? But economically, Poland was the place. Germany was full of persecutions. So rabbis who set up Polish Jewry, Rabbi Yaakov Polak and Rabbi Sholem Shachna, emphasize minhag. We're creating a minhag Polin, and that is going to be our Polestar, not necessarily traditional Sikha. And that's why he says, Kemo Marenu Harav Reb Shachna Umarshal Ushar Gaonei Olam. And they emphasize minhag, which is why Ashkenaz always emphasizes minhag, Sephardim much less so. ולכן אין להרהר אחר המנהג שנהגו בגדולי ישראל, מי שרוצה להיות פורש יחמיר לעצמו. Look, you can always be strict, but don't make others do that. דלה ליתי לאנסויה, ודווקא למי שהורגל בשאר פרישות ומפורסם לחסיד. And you should only be strict if you're strict in every respect. When you pick and choose, when you cherry pick your chumras, that smacks of hypocrisy. כמו שכתב רבי, בראש ברכות, לרביה, לעניין קריאת שמע של ערבית. We have this about קריאת שמע של ערבית, about davening on time and this and that. He says, don't be such a fine shmeka, unless you are a fine shmeka across the board. ולא כמו שעושה המשוגע הזה, and really letting loose now at this maniac, שמדקדק באיסור חדש ושל גויים, he granted keeps the Isur of Chadash, שאין בו איסור יותר לכל יותר כי מדרבנן, which at the very worst, best might be אסור מדרבנן, ואינו נזהר בעבירות חמורות, and he is dissolute, he gets drunk, and he speaks divrei nevala, and all sorts of other things. כמעט בכל יום היום ולנבל פיו, and he's disgusting when he speaks and he uses foul language. אוי לו לנפשו השם הליגל התלמוד ועל הגאונים, and he uses it when he talks about the Talmud and the Gaonim. He criticizes me and what I teach in the yeshiva. ובשאר דברים שאסור להעלותם על הכתב, I can't even write them down. סוף דבר, מאחר שחזן ההוא נשא ליבו להורות הוראה במקומי, because the chazan thinks he can give halachic decisions and push me aside, hefet varai shelo kadin, and he's wrong, umakom shani oser hu matir, umakom shani matir hu oser, kol ze lo pam achat upamayim, more horaot befanai, hefet varai achar hatra, pam upamayim depshita shu ra'ui lenadoto. So he's definitely deserving of being put into cherem. Chal hanidui kedin, and that cherem would be absolutely legally sound. Omeata, כיוון שנתפעל שהנידוי שנידיתיו כדין הייתה, כדין, הייתה ראוי לך שתסדר לו תשובה על מעשיו. Now you, the Maharal, should in fact, in reality, have made him promise to do tshuva and given him a list of penances to do. Okay? But you are not guilty. Apparently, the Maharal wrote to the board of the community and said, based on what the Chazan told me, your rabbi, the Bach, is out of line. Cancel the cherem. And then the Bach is now writing his letter to the Maharal, telling him what happened, and as I said, as you can see, being very upset by the turn of events. Now he says, page 4, line 2, Ein alecha asham. You're not guilty, he says to the Maharal nicely. לא ידעת תוכן העניין, you didn't know what actually happened. ופרט כל מעשה ומעשה שנעשה. אמנם, מכל מקום, אינו ראוי לתת כתוב וחתום בדרך פסק דין, ביד הבעל דין טרם שמוע דברי שכנגדו בדין. But this is a criticism of the Maharal, if it was the Maharal, okay, this Reb Lever. He says, look, why did you write a letter to the committee without consulting me first? You didn't hear my side. Any judge knows that you have to hear both sides. Anybody know how to say that in Latin? You have to hear both sides. Audi alterum partem. Partum. Have to hear both sides to the case. Or we could say, Shamoa bein achechem u'shpatatem tzedek. Have to hear the two sides. Why didn't you listen to me? Because they sira Torah kanoda. When your letter arrived at the committee informed me what you'd written, all my bones turned to jelly. V'na'uti mishmoa, and I was trembling in fear. Ve'inai timda damoa, and my eyes filled with tears. V'kol shom av titzalena shtei oznav, and anybody who heard this, his ears rang. Oy lo al bizayon Torah v'lomdim shekra lefanav u'mi yachush lichvod Torah. It's the Torah that has been disgraced in this context. Va'ata nitpatata leish hamushuga be'inyanav. You were unfortunately led astray by this Meshugana. Va'ata nitpate l'shote sar tzilo, as we read in the Torah, sar tzilam, okay? ובאמת אמרתי לחשובי הקהל שיקיימו דברים ככתבם וכלשונם. Now, I actually said, when we got the letter from you, said to the heads of the committee, you know what? Okay, let's cancel the cherem. אמנם הם חשו לכבודך וגם לכבודי, but they said, no way. It is the dignity and honor of the Talmidei Chachamim, of you and me. וכבוד התורה ולומדיה שלא יתחלל בפני ההמון. והנה ביקשתי מכבודך, תביט בעין החמלה על כל דברי אלה, נלחץ ושלום פשעתי, אקבל הדין. But now, if you think that I've done wrong, well, then tell me. ואם פשעו כנגדי, תיאסרנו בנידוי ושמטה. But if he's the sinner, then punish him with a cherem and a nidui, ve'ala and a curse and an oath, ve'takana lichvod HaTorah, and restore the honor of the Torah. He should be forced to recant from his totally crazy ideas. And your reputation will be enhanced and go higher and higher. Ad biyat goel, tzchok pinu malei yemaleu shonenu rina. Yirat Sair, hakatan Yoel ben Ladoni Avi Maren Rav Shmuel, Zechet Sadik lechayei haolam haba. Okay, so that's a tshuva. The reactions to the Bach and what happened afterwards is next week. So I'll stop the screen share and hope that you agree that was a fairly entertaining tshuva, but describes some amazing things that go on. And this is the Bach. We learned for Smicha and before that. We learn the Bach regularly with the tour. I mean, who is like the Bach? And yet you see in the tshuva that things weren't necessarily as easy and as smooth as all that, especially early on in his career. And you also get to have some feeling for the types of Jews that were around. You can have somebody who is an absolute scoundrel, but can make themselves extremely effective in communal matters. So there we are. Ian, you want to say something? Speak.
I'm just surprised he's spent so many lines on this Meshuga. It's not very sophisticated, is it? To tell a story like that. You could have referred to it briefly and enough,
Apparently he was, okay? He justified the label Meshugana because, on basis of what I read, he was a terrible man. He doesn't know how
exaggerated.
He's contradicting the rabbi. he's using his expertise as a Baal Kriya, okay, which he thinks he's an expert on. And you can see that because this continued a long time, the Bach just absolutely lost his cool. I mean, you would too. What are you going to do? And then the committee, your committee gets a letter from the Gedol Ador, if it's the Maharal, saying that the Chazan is right and the rabbi is wrong. What are you going to do then? So you make a very strong case. By the way, the term Hamashugah Hazeh is used in rabbinic literature often. And also I should just let you know, Ian, that this is mild. Okay? If you go into medieval rabbinic sources, there's some invective there that's absolutely shocking, would be shocking for us today. We're not used to that sort of thing.
Don't we find that going all the way back to the Rambam? The Ravid on the Rambam? Don't we find the sharp language going all the way back to Rambam?
Rambam and before. Okay. We find it in the Gemara as well, by the way, since some sugyot punches are not pulled. But the Rambam, as Bernie says, Rambam writes, well, he writes about Mohammed. He says, Zeh HaMeshugah.
Oh.
Okay, but there we are. But the Rambam is quite sharp. And, Ibn Ezra, for example.
Isn't the Ravid sharp and antagonized?
Yeah, the Ravid says on the Rambam, when the Rambam says, Sichli Omer Li, the Ravid says, Sichlo Omer Lo, Bitno Omer Lo. It's not his intellect, it is his stomach, okay? We will hear about things that people did that are quite remarkable. Some rabbis, wanted to insult their colleagues, so they call their dogs after their colleagues, okay? All sorts of things. And somebody carved mamzer into the seat in shul of a particular enemy. I mean, the list goes on and on, but verbal attacks were certainly made, and so Meshugah is fairly mild, actually.
There is a Gemara, Abin Shatia Matne Stituta Libre.
Exactly. Okay? Well, that's shtut, okay? But I mean, the idea of calling people a fool and a nincompoop and an idiot certainly found. So Meshugah is not bad. And on the facts of the case, I'd say it's perfectly justified. Okay. So next week, we're going to look at the reactions of Poskim after the Bach to his Heter. Some interesting things like the Baal Shem Tov, who had a weakness for beer, and we'll find out about that. We'll end up with comparing the Mishnah Brura and the Aruch HaShulchan along the fault lines here between the Poskim and Minhag and accommodation as usual. And then I want to go into, to finish off the Bach, next week will be our last session before Pesach, okay? And then we have a 2-week break because Wednesdays are both Seder night and Motzei Chag. And Chag, of course, Shmini, it'll be Shvi and Shmini Shel Pesach in Switzerland, okay, and elsewhere. But we will talk about the economic aspect, and a couple of tshuvot of the Bach are going into the reasons why, Poland was so attractive economically for Jews from the 14th century onwards. And as we said last time, Ian, why that economic success actually laid the basis for the terrible persecution in the 17th century of the Khmelnytsky massacres because of the hatred of the peasants and the Cossacks for the Jews because of their economic control. So it's always a double-edged sword. See you all next week. Besorot Tovot.
Oh, man.
And Shabbat Shalom. And may we all have the best and optimal news. Bye for now.
Good night. Chodesh Tov.
Good night.
Good evening. Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov, exactly.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov, a guten Chodesh.